Out this afternoon. Our prayers and thoughts are with them. We've got a lot of folks who are not able to be with us this afternoon, so we hope they get feeling better and are able to be back with us soon. As is our custom on our song service day, we'll be looking through the book of Psalms, and today we look at Psalm 90, attributed as a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Moses was referred to as a man of God in the book of Genesis 3 or 4 times. There are other men throughout the Bible referred to as a man of God, having reference to the fact that he was a faithful servant of God, that he was a possession of God, that he walked with God, that he knew what God wanted, and he walked with God. He obeyed God. And so here God inspires the psalmist David to write down a psalm of Moses, if you will, a prayer of Moses. And there are other psalms that have attribution to others, and that shouldn't cause us any strange feelings. If God inspired David to write these psalms and give them attribution to other men, then so be it. This psalm is interesting or different from other psalms, obviously because of the author. We don't know when this psalm was written, but based on the majority of the text, I think we could consider that this may have been towards the end of Moses' life and towards the end of the 40 years wilderness wanderings, based on some of the things that he mentions. And though obviously these would have been things that he was thinking about during the time of his life, these are applicable to us today as well. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting thou art God. Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, return ye, children of men. Moses begins this prayer, this psalm, by pointing out the eternal nature of God, the almighty power of God, as we studied in our Bible class this morning, that before the mountains or before the earth was created, there was God. God is. He is everlasting to everlasting. He is eternal, and He is our dwelling place. He is a place of safety from generation to generation. And though men, and the rest of this psalm kind of gets into this, though men will come and go from generation to generation, God never goes. God is. And every generation finds himself growing before the Lord, and either choosing to obey God or to reject God. But as the seasons come and go and the fields come and go, so man comes and goes. And there may be a different generation, but there's still God, the same God. He says, thou turnest man to destruction, or the idea there is back to the dust. Genesis 3 verse 19, from dust you came, from dust you'll return. Man has a beginning and a man has an end, but God doesn't. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Thou carriest them away as with a flood, they are as asleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. In the morning it flourisheth and groweth up, in the evening it is cut down and withereth. For we are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath we are troubled. So here once again he gets into that eternal nature of God, as opposed to the short or brevity of our lives. To God, 1,000 years is nothing. It doesn't mean that one day equals 1,000 years. That's not logical. One day doesn't equal 1,000 years, not in anybody's sight. God's the one that defined time. He defined time as a day equaling one 24-hour period, not 1,000 years. So God's not going to make time, a day, equal 24-hour period, and then go around and say something silly, like one day is like 1,000 years, and mean that literally. What this means is 1,000 years to God is like a day to us in time, passing away. It's not much at all to God, because He's eternal. He doesn't He's not obsessed with time like we are, is he? Because he doesn't know time in that sense. He's eternal. There's never been a time when God isn't. And so he refers to it as like a watch in the night. In the Jewish time, there were 3 watches in the night. In the Roman period, there were 4 watches in the night. And that's how they would divide the day, right? They would divide it by watch. There would be individuals who would have a watch over that night period. Well, 1,000 years to God is just like taking watch overnight, right? I mean, that's just something he does. So it's the idea here is a comparison of the eternality of God and the brevity of man. That's the whole point. The shortness of life as opposed to the eternality of God. Life comes and goes, and it comes quickly and it goes quickly, like a flood. A flood comes through, and unfortunately we've seen on the TV, rushing water can take down trees, can take cars, and just, it's there one moment and then it's gone the next, right? And so it's like the grass. You cut it one day and it looks short and brown, and the next day it's grown up again, right? It's green. It's like, and he makes a comparison here later on to that man is like that grass, that generations are like that grass, that one generation of grass comes up, it starts from nothing, it grows up, it becomes green and mature, and then it passes away, right? It gets cut, and then guess what? Another generation comes back up, and that's like man. One generation is born, grows up, gets old, passes away, and then another generation takes its place. And then when he says, we are consumed by thine anger and by thy wrath, most commentators think here that he's making a reference to the general nature of death. That death became a part of life, if you will, because man sinned. That we don't die because God's mad at us, but the death itself entered into the world at the time of sin. And so it was perhaps a point at which God said man's not going to live forever, physically. Eternally or spiritually we are, obviously, from the time we're born. Verse 8, thou hast set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins in the light of thy countenance, for all our days are passed away in thy wrath. We spend our years as a tale that is told. That's a beautiful statement, isn't it? And there's so much that could be said there, and that there's a sermon in and of itself. We spend our years as a tale that is told. Every story has what? An introduction, a conclusion, and then the main body. Well, that's life, isn't it? We have a beginning, we have an end, and then our main body, our story gets told. And so no matter how long we live, we have a beginning and an end, and then whatever comes in between, that's our story, isn't it? That's our tale. And so if we don't like how our story is going, we can change it, right? We can do things to change our story. Our tale is still being told, isn't it? As you and I sit here today, our tale is still being told. We have a beginning, and we're in the middle of our story, but we haven't ended it yet. So as long as we're here, as long as we have opportunity, if we don't like the direction we're going, we can make a change in our lives. Verse 10, the days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. So here, obviously, a reference to the brevity of life again, and this obviously would be in context to the years of man after the flood. Methuselah lived to be about 969 years, and perhaps that might have been what God was referring to in verse 4, Moses, for 1,000 years is but yesterday. Methuselah wasn't old in the eyes of God, was he? 969 years, But now Moses says, look, today, because of after the flood, obviously the world changed. The ozone changed, the atmosphere changed, and so the days of our lives, the years of our lives changed. And he doesn't mean that everybody's going to live to 70 or 80, but that's just a general age, isn't it? A general age. today because of technology and medical advancements. Sometimes we live even farther than that. And I think Moses references that. He said, well, even if you live past 70, you're still going to hurt a little, right? Isn't that what he says? You might live past 80 or whatever, but your strength is going to go down a little bit, isn't it? And it's going to hurt a little bit more to get up in the morning. And every year you're old, another year older, it's going to be a little bit more harder, right? That's life. And so then he says, who knoweth the power of thine anger, even according to thy fear, so is thy wrath. Well, they knew the power of God. They had seen it coming out of Egypt. They had seen it in making them wander in the wilderness, didn't they? And now they were about to see it as they were going to cross over the Jordan River. Now, Moses wasn't going to get to see that. And so maybe this explains why Moses was kind of talking about how short life is. You know, he knew that his life was about to come to an end, that his tale had been told. And it was going to end before they went into Canaan. So he knew his life was short. And so he says, teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. And so whether you live 969 years, or whether you live 70 years or 80 years, use your time the best that you can. That's what Moses is saying here. And that's what God's telling us through this inspired writing. It's not that 1,000 years equals a day, or a day equals 1,000 years. It's however long you get to be here, make the best of your story. Use your time as wisely as possible. And of course, we can't use our time here in this life any more wiser than assembling together, singing praises of God together, studying together, worshiping God together. And so he says, teach us to number our days. That is, let's put our days before us, not to waste them, and not think as one day is not worth as much as another day, you see. And then he calls upon God to return to his merciful ways. And of course, as the people of Israel would cross into Canaan, the days of wandering in the wilderness would be over. And there would be days where, verse 15, make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us. Israel was about to see some days that were as good as the days in the wilderness were bad, right? They were about to see some good days. And sometimes that's how life is, isn't it? We see some bad days and we see some good days. And he says, let thy work appear unto thy servants, unto thy glory unto their children. They were going to see the power of God. And when they came into Canaan, if you study the book of Joshua, there's no doubt that they saw the hand of God taking care of them and defeating those enemies. And what did they do? They taught it to their children. They reminded their children. They set up memorials. At the end of Joshua's life, he said, me and my family, me and my house are going to follow God. We're going to obey God. And so they looked at the evidences, and that's what Moses wanted for them, right? To see the good and glorify God throughout their generations and teach that to their children. And then in verse 17, let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish thou the work of our hands upon us, yea, the work of our hands establish thou it. In other words, the work that you've got for us to do, Lord, be with us and help us complete it. Now, for Joshua and those individuals that would live after Moses and take Canaan, that's exactly what happened. And Moses was a faithful man. He wasn't a sinlessly perfect man, and nor are we. But we can follow his advice, we can follow his example, and we can look to God too, for whatever good we need to accomplish, to ask for God to help us complete that. And of course, we can't complete anything if we don't first start. And if we don't, and we're not going to start unless we want to. So we have to devise in our minds the desire to do it. And then we have to give ourselves use our abilities to the best that we can, the strengths that we have, and then ask God for help. Don't ask God for help if we're not going to do it, or if we don't want to do it. Because God's not going to make you do it, and God's not going to give you any supernatural power to do it. It first starts with me and my wants and my desires and my abilities, and then help us complete this work. So this is obviously applicable to us today. God has made His wishes and His blessings known to us, and we have the Old Testament to learn from and to gain wisdom from. And we know that when God says to do a thing, He means it. And we also know that God rewards those who are obedient. And so when God tells us to hear His word and believe it and repent of our past sins, then we ought to do that. When He calls upon us to confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, we need to do that. When the Bible tells us that we contact the blood that washes away sin through water baptism, we need to do that. We know the consequences of disobedience from learning from the ways of Israel as well. And so we need to take their example in mind as well as the example of those who are obedient. And if we want to start the work, then we know how. We obey those initial steps. The Lord will add us to His church. Acts 2 verse 47. And then our work just gets started. And then we ask the Lord to help us complete the work, to be as strong with that work. And we do that by counting our days, numbering our days, and being wise with our days. And so let us be wise with our days, being faithful to the Lord. If you have any need this afternoon to obey the gospel, the invitation is open. If you've already obeyed those initial acts but have something else that we can assist you with, we're here to help as we stand and sing.
Would you live for Jesus and be always pure and good? Would you walk with Him within the